The air in the lawyer's office is thick, smelling of old paper and a forced, sterile calm. Outside, rain lashes against the tall windows, a fitting soundtrack to the tension humming between the three of us in the room. Me, my older brother, Mark, and Mr. Henderson, the executor, perched behind a dark, imposing desk piled high with documents. Mark sits opposite me, leaning back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, the kind of look that says he knows something I don't, that he's already won. His eyes flick over me, a dismissive sweep from head to toe, landing briefly on my worn jacket before returning to the polished surface of the desk. It's been this way my whole life. Him, effortlessly polished, me, always feeling a little less. Always the quiet one, the one who needed a little extra help, the one who didn't quite fit his mold of success. Our parents are gone. 2 months now. It still feels unreal, a physical ache in my chest. But the business of death waits for no one. And Mark, well, Mark sees this as simply the next stage of business. He clears his throat, a loud, confident sound in the quiet room. The lawyer adjusts his glasses, picks up a thick envelope. My hands are clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles are white. I can feel the tremor in my fingers. Mark catches my eye, his smirk widening just a fraction. He leans forward, his voice low, meant only for my ears, a venomous whisper cutting through the silence before the reading begins. He says, "Don't look so nervous. It's not like you ever had much writing on this anyway. You are always the burden. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know." My life, before all this, wasn't remarkable. It was quiet, predictable. I wasn't the star of the show, ever. That was Mark. From the moment he was born, 5 years before me, he shone brighter. He was the natural athlete, the one who breezed through school, the one who knew how to charm anyone, including our parents. He was the golden child. And I was me. Introverted. Prone to getting sick. A little clumsy. I loved books and quiet corners. I wasn't bad, not exactly, but I wasn't Mark. Our parents loved us both, I knew that. Or, I thought I knew that. But love takes different forms, doesn't it? For Mark, it was pride. It was showing him off, celebrating his achievements, funding his ambitions. For me, it felt more like caretaking. Like I was a delicate plant that needed constant attention, a problem to be managed. My mother was fiercely protective, almost to a fault. My father was gentler, quieter, but his gaze often held a hint of worry when he looked at me. They never said I was a burden, not in so many words. But Mark did. From the time we were teenagers, when I needed a ride somewhere, or when I struggled with a subject he found easy, or when my anxiety flared up and I couldn't face a family gathering. "You're such a burden," he'd sigh, rolling his eyes. It became a casual cruelty, tossed out whenever I inconvenienced him, whenever I existed in a way that wasn't perfectly convenient for his world. And because he said it, because he was the golden child, it felt true. It settled deep in my bones, a cold, heavy stone. Our house was comfortable, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined street. Not a mansion, but solid, well-loved. My father had built a good life for us. He ran a successful, if somewhat old-fashioned, manufacturing business. Mark was groomed to take over. He'd spent summers working there, went to business school, interned at fancy firms, all on the path laid out for him. My path was less defined. I went to a local college, drifted through a few different majors, eventually found something I liked, something quiet and solitary, working with data, far away from the noise and expectation of the family business. Mark used this as more evidence of my inadequacy. While I'm building an empire, he'd scoff, "You're counting beans in a basement office." He made it sound pathetic. And sometimes, late at night, I believed him. There were moments, though, quiet moments, mostly with my parents alone, when things felt different. My mother teaching me to bake her complicated, comforting recipes, her hands guiding mine. My father sitting with me while I read, not saying much, just his presence a quiet strength, sometimes asking me about the book, genuinely interested. Little gestures that, at the time, felt small compared to the grand pronouncements of Mark's future success, but now, looking back, glimmered with a different kind of light. A steady, unconditional light. But the constant drip of Mark's narrative, that I was weak, incapable, a drain on resources, a burden, it was like poison. It seeped into everything, coloring my own self-perception. I started to believe it myself. Why would they leave anything substantial to me? I wouldn't know what to do with it. I couldn't handle it. Mark could. Mark deserved it. That's what he'd always said. That's what I'd come to expect. The call came on a Tuesday morning. The kind of call you know is coming but are never ready for.
À car accident.
Both of them.
Gone. Just like that.
The world tilted. Grief arrived not as a wave, but as a crushing weight, stealing my breath, leaving me hollowed out. The days that followed were a blur of logistics, distant relatives, and the suffocating quiet of the empty house. Mark was different immediately. He was deficient, clinical. While I stumbled through the fog of shock, he was on the phone with lawyers, funeral directors, distant cousins. He took charge of everything, and his tone towards me shifted. It wasn't just casual mockery anymore. It was possessive, dismissive, as if, with our parents gone, there was no one left to even pretend I wasn't an inconvenience. "I'll handle everything," he told me, waving a hand as I stared blankly at a pile of paperwork. "You just try not to fall apart. Someone has to keep it together." He said it like a chore he was reluctantly undertaking. Like dealing with my grief was another burden he had to bear. He started talking about the estate in hushed, reverent tones, like a kingdom he was about to inherit. He walked through the house, not with sorrow, but with evaluation in his eyes. He pointed out things, the antique clock, the paintings, the furniture, making mental notes, already allocating. He spoke about selling the business, downsizing, investing. His plans were grand, decisive. My input was neither sought nor desired. "Don't worry your head about it," he'd said when I timidly asked about the will. "There are derangements. Everything's taken care of," he paused, looking at me with that familiar, pitying gaze. "Just make sure you're okay. That's the main thing. We wouldn't want any complications." The implication hung heavy in the air. I was the potential complication. My inability to cope, my lack of practical sense, my general meanness. He was already mentally allocating a small, manageable sum for me, enough to keep me from being a burden on him, while he took the reins of the real wealth, the business, the property. He probably imagined setting up a small trust one couldn't touch, managed by him, of course, ensuring I wouldn't squander it. It was demeaning, soul-crushing. The grief for my parents was a raw wound, but the way Mark treated me layered it with a burning shame. Was this really how they saw me? How everyone saw me? Incapable? A burden? The days stretched into weeks, each one a slow, painful crawl towards the inevitable will reading. Mark grew more and more confident. He spoke openly now about his plans, assuming his inheritance. He talked about selling the business quickly before the market shifted. He talked about buying a new car, taking a trip. He acted as if the money was already in his account, already his to command. His arrogance was a suffocating cloud in the house we now shared, temporarily. He brought boxes, starting to pack up things he deemed valuable, things he wanted, without consulting me. He even went into my parents' bedroom, a place I hadn't been able to bring myself to enter, and started sorting through their belongings. I found him one afternoon holding my mother's jewelry box, running a string of pearls through his fingers, appraising them. It felt like a violation. "They won't need this anymore," he'd said, noticing me in the doorway, not a hint of remorse in his voice. High time we got organized. I remember one particular argument, fueled by his assumption of control. He was on the phone, talking loudly about selling the old warehouse the business owned, a property that had been in our family for generations. I finally found my voice, small and trembling, asking if we should maybe talk about these things together. He'd laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Together? What's there to talk about? I'm handling it. This is my inheritance, my responsibility. What would you even know about property deals? Stay out of it. You wouldn't want to mess things up." He hung up, turning to face me, his eyes hard. "Look, I know this is hard for you," he'd said, though his tone conveyed the opposite. "But someone has to be practical. Someone has to make the tough decisions. That's always been me. You've always been the other one. The one who needs looking after." His words were a punch to the gut. They echoed Mark's earlier, quieter cruelty, but now they held the weight of his assumed power, his imminent control over our parents' legacy. He wasn't just calling me a burden anymore. He was stating it as a fact, a defining characteristic that disqualified me from any meaningful part in the future. And the worst part was, a part of me still believed him. The stone in my gut grew heavier. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was incapable. Maybe it was better if he handled everything. The thought was a betrayal of my own worth, but it was a familiar, almost comforting narrative. The day of the will reading arrived like a looming storm cloud. I barely slept the night before, tossing and turning, the words, "You were always the burden," playing on repeat in my mind. I chose a simple, dark dress, something that wouldn't attract attention. Mark arrived at the lawyer's office in a sharp suit, looking every bit the successful heir. He greeted Mr. Henderson with a confident handshake, already talking about needing copies of documents for his financial advisor. He didn't even look at me, not really, until we were seated in the quiet room. That's when he delivered the line, the final confirmation of his contempt, his absolute certainty of the outcome. "You were always the burden." The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the papers. Mr. Henderson was an older man, kind eyes behind thick spectacles, a gentle demeanor that seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. He spoke softly, formally, reading the preamble, identifying himself as the executor appointed by my parents. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment when my lifelong fear, fueled by Mark's constant jibes, would be confirmed. I braced myself for the polite legalese that would explain why the bulk of the estate was going to Mark, with perhaps a small allowance for me, managed, of course. Mr. Henderson began reading the disposition of assets. He listed bank accounts, investments, life insurance policies. As he read, Mark's smile grew. He nodded along, occasionally glancing at me with that smug, superior look. This was exactly what he expected. The numbers were substantial. The business, the house, the investments, it was a significant fortune. I felt a familiar wave of inadequacy wash over me. What would I even do with that kind of money? Mark was right. I was a burden, even to an inheritance. Then Mr. Henderson's tone shifted slightly. He read a clause about the family business. "The ownership and management of Miller Manufacturing," he read, "shall be transferred in its entirety to my child." He paused, looking up over his glasses. Mark shifted in his seat, puffing out his chest slightly. Of course. This was it. The formal transfer of the kingdom. My child, Sarah Miller. My breath hitched. Sarah Miller? That was me. Mark froze. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of startled confusion. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no sound came out. The lawyer continued, reading the next sentence. "Recognizing her quiet strength, diligence, and unwavering integrity, which have been tested and proven in ways known privately to us, it is our profound wish that Sarah assumes full control and responsibility for the company we built." Quiet strength? Diligence? Integrity? My parents had seen that in me, not the burden? Mark was staring at the lawyer, then at me, his eyes wide, disbelieving. The air in the room crackled. Mr. Henderson continued, his voice steady. "Furthermore, the family home, located at 17 Chestnut Lane, including all its contents, shall also be bequeathed solely to Sarah Miller." Solely? The house. The house Mark had been appraising, mentally selling off piece by piece? Mark made a small, choke sound. He looked like he'd been slapped. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. This wasn't right. This wasn't the plan. His face was beginning to drain of color. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again, moving to the next section. "Regarding our financial assets, including all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and liquid funds, these are to be divided as follows. A sum representing 10% of the total liquid assets shall be distributed to Mark Miller. The remaining 90% shall be transferred to Sarah Miller. 90%? My mind reeled. The business, the house, 90% of the money. It was everything. It was the opposite of everything Mark had said, everything I had braced myself for. The stone in my gut didn't just feel heavy anymore. It felt like it was glowing, warm and expanding, pushing back against the years of self-doubt. Mark's face was pure white now, his eyes wide with shock and something else, panic. He finally found his voice, a hoarse whisper.
What? No.
That's impossible. There has to be a mistake. Mr. Henderson remained unperturbed. There is no mistake, Mr. Miller. This document was drafted and executed precisely according to your parents' wishes. He picked up another smaller document. They also included a letter, to be read after the will. He adjusted his glasses and began to read, his voice carrying the weight of their final message. To our dear children, the letter began. If you are hearing this, we are no longer with you. Our deepest wish is that you find peace and happiness. Mark, you have always been ambitious, driven, with a sharp mind for business. We saw your potential early on and we encouraged it. We wanted you to succeed. But in recent years, we have observed behaviors that gave us pause. Your focus on wealth, sometimes at the expense of empathy. Your tendency to see people as means to an end. We saw your plans, Mark. We saw what you intended to do with the business, the staff who have been loyal to us for decades, the land. Your plans were not ours. Our legacy is not just profit, it is people, community, the values we built. We hoped you would understand this, but it became clear that you were charting a different course, one that would dismantle much of what we valued. My parents, they knew. They had seen through Mark's facade, seen his true intentions. A cold knot of dread formed on Mark's face as the letter continued. Sarah, you are listening to this, likely feeling unprepared, perhaps even overwhelmed. This is understandable. You have always been sensitive, quiet, with a gentle heart. Mark has, regrettably, often overshadowed you, creating a narrative of your dependence that is simply untrue. What he perceives as weakness, we saw as strength, the strength to be true to yourself, to find joy in quiet pursuits, to value integrity and kindness above all else. We also saw your intelligence, your ability to absorb information, to see patterns others miss. And we saw something else, Sarah. Something you may not even realize we knew. Mr. Henderson paused, looking directly at me. Your father discovered, some time ago, Mark's attempts to manipulate the company's finances. Small things at first, disguised cleverly but growing bolder. We saw his attempts to sideline long-serving managers who questioned him. We saw his plan to undervalue company assets, particularly the old warehouse property, in anticipation of our deaths, intending to sell it off for a quick, personal profit, one he had already arranged through shell companies. The air left Mark's lungs with a whoosh. He staggered back in his chair, as if struck. His face was no longer just pale, it was ashen, terrified. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The letter continued, the words delivering blow after blow to Mark's carefully constructed reality. We did not confront Mark directly. We hoped he would change. When he did not, we began to make arrangements. We needed someone who would protect the business, the employees, the land, from being exploited. We needed someone we could trust implicitly, someone whose integrity was beyond question, someone who would follow our true wishes. That person is you, Sarah. You have the quiet determination to see things through, the intelligence to learn the business, and the moral compass to do the right thing. We have arranged for trusted advisors, loyal to us and the company, to guide you. The control we have given you is absolute, Sarah. Use it wisely. Protect our legacy. As for the property Mark intended to manipulate, the warehouse, it is explicitly stated in the will that this property is to be held in trust for the employees' pension fund, its value protected, its sale prohibited without the unanimous consent of the employee council. We ensured it could not be exploited. That was the twist. Not just getting the inheritance, but getting it in a way that completely dismantled Mark's secret, calculated plans, revealing his deception and protecting the very assets he was targeting. It wasn't just receiving wealth. It was receiving the keys to the kingdom he wanted to plunder, explicitly entrusting me with the power to stop him, armed with the knowledge of his betrayal. The letter ended with words of love for both of us, a plea for unity that landed hollow in the now shattered room. Mr. Henderson finished reading, placing the letter on the desk. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the drumming rain against the window and Mark's ragged breathing. He was staring at the desk, then at me, then at the lawyer, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. His carefully crafted persona, his years of assuming the mantle of the golden heir, lay in ruins around him. He had spent his life building himself up by tearing me down, convincing himself and trying to convince everyone else that I was useless, a drain, a burden. He had been so utterly convinced of his own superiority, his own entitlement, that he hadn't seen what was happening right under his nose. He hadn't seen his parents' quiet disapproval, their careful planning, their ultimate trust in the child he had always dismissed. He hadn't seen me at all. He had seen only his own reflection, distorted by greed and contempt. And I sat there, the initial shock fading, replaced by a strange, cold calm.
The stone in my gut was gone.
In its place was a quiet strength, the strength my parents had seen, a strength I hadn't known I possessed until this moment. Mark's face contorted. He choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. You knew? You must have known. I hadn't. Not the details, not the extent of their knowledge, not the meticulous way they had protected their legacy and put me in charge. But as he spoke, as his accusation hung in the air, a memory surfaced. A conversation with my father, weeks before the accident. He had been looking at the old ledger books from the business, his brow furrowed. He'd asked me about financial analysis, about spotting discrepancies, about data integrity. I'd worked with data, that quiet, solitary job Mark had mocked. I'd explained what I knew, the principles, the red flags. He'd listened intently, asked surprisingly detailed questions for someone supposedly unfamiliar with modern data analysis. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, showing an interest in my work. Now I understood. He was gathering information. He was using my quiet skills, the very ones Mark dismissed, to understand the extent of his other son's betrayal. No, I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself with its calmness. I didn't know the details. But they saw you, Mark. They saw what you were doing. His face crumpled. It wasn't just the loss of the inheritance, the business, the house. It was the exposure, the humiliation. His parents, the people he had presumably been trying to impress, had seen his true character and had systematically shut him out, not just financially, but morally. They had chosen the burden over the golden child. They had placed their trust, their legacy, in the hands of the one he deemed weakest. The ultimate, irrefutable proof that his narrative was a lie, that his contempt for me was unfounded, that his own judgment was fatally flawed. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. It scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. This is a joke, he spat, not at me, but at the room, at the lawyer, at the world. You think she can run a company? She can barely run her own life. You'll ruin it. You'll ruin everything. He was losing control. The mask was off. The arrogance was replaced by raw, ugly panic and fury. Mr. Henderson spoke calmly, deliberately. Your parents made comprehensive arrangements, Mr. Miller. Advisors are in place. All necessary resources are available. Sarah is the sole owner. Her authority is final. He turned to me, his voice gentler. Sarah, there are documents to sign. We can arrange a meeting with the company's senior management at your convenience. They have been informed of the general transition. They are waiting for your direction. Waiting for my direction. The quiet one. The burden. The words resonated in the air, stripped of their power, replaced by a dawning sense of purpose, a heavy responsibility, but also a profound vindication. Mark stared at me, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. The man who had always seemed invincible, who had always made me feel small and inadequate, was exposed, defeated, his world crumbling around him. And I, the supposed burden, was the one standing in the ruins of his plans, holding the keys to the kingdom he had tried to steal. Leaving the lawyer's office felt surreal. The rain had stopped. Sunlight dappled on the wet pavement. Mark stormed out ahead of me, not saying another word, getting into his car and speeding away. I walked out slowly, the weight of the documents in my hands feeling both heavy and strangely light. It wasn't just paper, it was proof. Proof of my parents' love, their foresight, their trust. Proof that everything Mark had told me, everything I had internalized, was a lie. The journey home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove, the events of the past hour replaying in my mind. Mark's face when the lawyer read my name, his choked accusation, his raw fury, and my own reaction, the initial shock, the slow dawning of understanding, the quiet, resolute calm that settled over me. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was something deeper, more complex. A profound sadness for the fractured family, for the brother who was lost in his own ambition. But beneath the sadness, a bedrock of quiet satisfaction. I hadn't just received an inheritance. I had been given a chance to rewrite my own story, to step out of the shadow of being the burden and into the light of the person my parents believed me to be. Arriving back at the house felt different too. It wasn't just the place where I grew up, it was my house now. The air didn't feel heavy with grief and Mark's looming presence. It felt quiet, expectant. I walked through the rooms, seeing them with new eyes. The antique clock Mark had eyed, it wasn't just an asset. It was a memory of my father winding it every Sunday. The kitchen where my mother taught me to bake, it was filled with the echoes of her laughter. These weren't just possessions. They were anchors to a past I needed to protect, a legacy built on love and hard work, not exploitation. The days that followed were a whirlwind, but not of the kind Mark had planned. Meetings with the senior managers at Miller Manufacturing. They were initially wary, unsure what to expect from the quiet, unexpected owner. But they were also fiercely loyal to the company, to my parents' vision. I listened. I asked questions. I admitted what I didn't know, but demonstrated a genuine desire to learn, to understand. And I showed them the specific clause in the will about the warehouse property, the one that protected the employee pension fund. Seeing my parents' foresight and my commitment to upholding it shifted something. Trust began to build. We started working together, slowly, carefully, building a plan for the future that honored the past. Mark tried to contest the will, of course. His lawyer sent letters, full of bluster and legal jargon. But Mr. Henderson was prepared. My parents had anticipated this. The will was airtight, ironclad. The letter revealing Mark's attempted manipulations, backed by evidence my father had quietly compiled, made any challenge impossible without exposing Mark's actions publicly, ruining his reputation entirely. He backed down. The 10% he was given? He took it. It was a pittance compared to what he expected, but it was something. I heard he used it to make a few desperate, ill-advised investments trying to recoup his losses, investments that failed spectacularly. His grand plans for empire building crumbled. The golden child had fallen, not from a dramatic height, but from the slow, steady erosion of his own character, finally exposed by the very people he thought he had fooled. My life now is full. Challenging, sometimes overwhelming, but full. Running the business is hard work, demanding constant learning. There are moments of doubt, days when the weight of responsibility feels immense. But I remember my parents' words in that letter. Their belief in my quiet strength. Their trust. And I remember Mark's face in that office, the moment his world collapsed. It wasn't a moment of triumph for me, not in a cruel sense. It was a moment of clarity. The burden was not me, it was the narrative that had been imposed upon me, the weight of someone else's contempt and misjudgment. And I was finally free of it. I haven't spoken to Mark since that day. There's nothing left to say. The distance between us is vast, a chasm dug by years of his cruelty and culminating in his final, exposed betrayal. Sometimes, I wonder if he ever understood. If he ever saw me, truly saw me, not as a burden, but as a person. I doubt it. Some people are too blinded by their own reflection. The house is quiet now, but it's my quiet. Filled with memories, not with Mark's assumptions. The business thrives, growing not through ruthless expansion, but through steady work and valuing the people who make it run. My parents' legacy is protected. And me? The quiet one. The burden. I am here. Standing tall. Carrying a weight, yes, but it's the weight of responsibility, of purpose, not the weight of shame or inadequacy. It's a weight I can carry. A weight I choose to carry. Because they believed I could. And it turns out they were right. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, subscribing really does help bring more of these stories to life. Thanks for being here.